The action of the work begins in a mysterious place, reminiscent of a medieval castle. A girl with long blonde hair sits on the floor, and someone gloomily says that it's time to put an end to this. The focus moves to the side. Now the audience can see that in front of the woman stands a slender young man in black clothes, reminiscent of some kind of ruthless judge or even executioner. He calls the blonde his sister, and she is unable to hold back her bitter tears because this whole situation, whatever it may be, weighs a monstrous burden on her heart. Here, the audience is shown a message that makes it clear that what they just saw was the latest installment in the popular anime and manga franchise called Heads and Tails. The heroine of the above-mentioned story, meanwhile, quietly asks a very short question, why? But without receiving an answer, she repeats it loudly and even gets up from her knees to look the boy straight in the face. The mysterious narrator tells the audience that the blonde is one of the main villains who has caused a lot of trouble for the main characters, and her name is Ivy Charlotte Spencer. The young villainess tried her best to make a calm face, but tears flowed like a waterfall from her azure eyes, and her voice trembled, revealing the girl's true emotions. In the end, she couldn't stand it and just screamed. The man Ivy was talking about was guilty of once killing their father, so she clearly hated him. And right now this killer, maintaining stony calm, stood in front of his defeated opponent. And what's more, Charlotte's own brother stood on his side. As the narrator's plaque tells us, this was the turning point when Spencer's crimes were revealed to society, and she was subjected to a humiliating trial that clearly ruined the rest of her life. After this, a short flashback begins. In it, you can see how the girl and her relative quarreled instead of uniting and communicating to cope with the tragedy. Ivy felt as if her half-brother, the man she trusted more than anyone else in this world, had betrayed her and backed her into a corner, depriving her of any opportunity to do otherwise. Then the girl crossed what is called the horizon of despair. She no longer had any connections with people. She began to not care about them and their thoughts. Charlotte seemed to have died inside. And in order to fulfill her cherished dream, Spencer decided to use a very dangerous thing, black magic, which was strictly prohibited in their home country. Having waited for the right moment, the young witch went to a secluded place. There she drew a pentagram on the floor, took a sharp blade, and bled herself a little as part of the ritual. With tears in her distraught eyes, the blonde laments that this should have been done from the very beginning. She tried many times to kill the enemy with the wrong hands, but with this means, she would have ended him long ago. It was a very dangerous and powerful ritual that no one should have resorted to. After all, its witchcraft power was such that it could destroy the entire area, as if by a nuclear bomb. The desperate villainess had no idea that she was being watched at the most important moment, and this was done by a man who looked suspiciously like her opponent. What happened next took only a few seconds. The mysterious man drew his sword and pierced Ivy through it, ending her retribution forever. As it turned out, the assassin was a young knight with short black hair and dark red eyes, a member of the Imperial Guard and a confidant of the prince himself. This man's name was Grayson Sacheza. Despite his apparent youth, he carried out his task absolutely calmly, without experiencing any emotions from killing a person, as if for him it was comparable to killing a cockroach. Here the action focuses on the real world. A girl in yellow-brown clothes walks along a busy street and screams loudly, looking at the screen of her phone. She looked at the image of Grayson saved in her mobile phone and could not get enough of it, furiously clicking on more and more new, although completely identical pictures. Having come to her senses and tired, the woman noted with some awkwardness that her gallery was filled to capacity with the same type of art of this character. That's how much she adores him. The poor thing didn't know that while she was carelessly fiddling with her cell phone, enjoying the handsome face of a fictional hero, right now there was a sinister figure behind her with a dagger in her hands. Drops of blood sprayed from the girl's mouth, and her face was distorted in a grimace of excruciating pain. She would probably have screamed if there had been any air left in her lungs. The mysterious criminal thrust the blade exactly between the main character's shoulder blades, where the vital organs were, thereby depriving her of any chance of survival, even with injury. After this, the action moves to an unknown place. After a long sleep, a small, round blonde girl opens her unnaturally purple eyes. She slept on a large, luxurious bed in a richly furnished room, but it looked more like something medieval than modern decoration. The door opens and a girl in a classic black and white maid outfit enters the room. She politely wishes the blonde baby good morning. Opening the windows with a smile and letting the sunshine into the room, the maid starts a cheerful speech about how nice the weather is today, and the sky really looked very clear and clean. Only after this does she finally turn to the perplexed little girl named Lady Ivy. The girl, hearing this, opens her mouth in shock, and sweat begins to flow down her face, as if she had just been told that the world was never round and was always on the back of a huge turtle. The servant, not noticing Ivy's reaction, warns that the doctor will come to her later, and until that moment it is better for the little lady to stay in bed and rest. There is a bandage on the girl's knees, as if she had suffered a painful blow not long ago, but in response to the maid's words, Ivy only nods, because she is lost in some thoughts of her own. The protagonist recalls how yesterday, while walking in the garden, she fell to the ground from a considerable height, frightening the elder woman accompanying her to death. The injury turned out to be minor, and the little girl tried to keep a calm face, but in fact she was in monstrous pain, and not only in her knee, a strange and severe discomfort also arose in her chest. And then the blonde remembered everything, and from the realization of the true state of things, she was unable to hold back her amazed sigh. Suddenly it turned out that she was the reincarnation of the same otaku girl from Earth who squealed at the sight of cute anime boys and was killed by an unknown person with a knife. Among the works that this woman especially liked was a manga about her favorite character, the young knight Grayson. It was called Heads or Tails. The setting of this work was a typical fantasy with knights, kings, and wizards, and the main character was a certain boy and his friends with whom he traveled around the world. Naturally, at the same time, they performed various feats, but that's not the point. Another key character in that manga was a blonde woman named Ivy Charlotte Spencer. She was a member of one of the 3 great royal families of Alba, a colossal empire that ruled the vast swath of the continent on which the story was set. The Spencers, as this family was called, were incredibly rich and influential, and their beloved daughter was distinguished by her angelic beauty. Her smile melted the hearts of even complete cynics. But Charlotte's good nature was feigned. In fact, she was an unprincipled and cruel villain, for whom killing a person was like sneezing into a handkerchief or asking for a spoonful of salt at dinner. And right now, this entrapment in someone else's body realized with horror that she was the infamous Ivy, just still very small and had not had time to do any mischief. After some time, the audience is shown the outside of the Spencer estate. It is not a very large but luxurious white-walled mansion in the middle of a green park. And in one of the rooms, the main character is trying to get used to the fact that she has mystically moved to another reality, and even finds herself in someone else's body. No emotions showed on the face of the young protagonist. The situation was simply so non-standard that it was difficult to say how to react to it at all. The girl, locked in the body of a child, remembers how in her native world she was calmly walking down the street, enjoying photos of her beloved hero, and suddenly received a knife in the back from an unknown person. Someone else might have thrown a tantrum, begging a higher power to return everything as it was. But the newly minted Ivy only frowned and folded her arms over her chest. Such composure was explained by the fact that in her old life the protagonist was an otaku, a fan of various anime and manga, so she was well aware of isekai, a genre dedicated to traveling to other universes. But what surprised the heroine most was that of all the possible worlds, she was thrown into this one, which corresponds to the smallest detail to her most favorite Japanese comic book. No, of course, the girl was very happy. After all, many fans would give limbs to actually be inside their favorite works and talk with their characters. But at the same time, the main character could not understand why, of all the possible candidates, she was thrown into the body of Ivy Charlotte, the main antagonist of the story. This heir to the great noble Spencer family had a beautiful, almost angelic appearance, which charmed and made many people from all walks of life fall in love with her. And it wasn't just about her appearance. She was involved in charity work, patronized orphanages, so she seemed to those around her to be something of a saint. For everyone, Ivy was the walking ideal of what a true lady should be, at the same time well-mannered, kind-hearted, and divinely attractive. And almost no one realized that it was this beauty who was responsible for numerous atrocities throughout the country. Using her wealth and connections, Spencer pulled the strings and tried to take revenge on the protagonist, blaming him for the death of her father. She stopped at nothing to finish off the unfortunate young man. She hired assassins and ordinary thugs from the gates, slandered and deceived. This created a very stark contrast. To outsiders, Ivy was something of an angel descended to earth to bring her a little more light. But her true essence was an insidious, ruthless, and hypocritical villain, for whom nothing was sacred or forbidden in achieving her goal. It was as if they were two very contrasting sides of one coin, the same heads and tails, embodied in one specific person. Even the former dugout mentally admits that the title of the manga perfectly characterized the essence of one of the key heroines, which she is now. But despite all the efforts of the main villain, she was ultimately betrayed by the only person she truly trusted, her own half-brother named Theodore. Subsequently, fate repaid Ivy for everything she had done. The girl was never able to take revenge on the protagonist and died alone, despised and hated by everyone. The memory of what fate befell the original owner of the body makes the main character sad, and she thinks hard about the future. Of course, she didn't want something similar to happen to her. What saddened the protagonist most of all was the fact that the character who was destined to kill Spencer in the future was her favorite. At the sight of him, the girl literally squealed with incredible delight. Even now, remembering his thin, emotionless face with scarlet eyes, the girl could not resist screaming madly and rolling on the bed. However, to call this relationship love would be a real understatement. In fact, the heroine adored the fictional hero to the point of madness, so she ended up hitting her forehead against the headboard of the bed, causing redness on her delicate skin. But this made the girl calm down and became quiet for a short time, but only to grab his face again and start reveling in his feelings for Knight Grayson and how sinister, cool, and brutal he looked. And only now does the main character realize that this nonsense needs to wait. Now other things are much more important. And the girl immediately remembers the trio of heroes. The protagonist remembers that the hero of the work, whom Spencer hated so much, should one day arrive at their estate. This will happen during winter. Fortunately, this will not happen too soon. There is still a whole year until the fateful day that will determine the entire future life of young Charlotte, so there will be more than enough time to prepare a plan. The poor woman, lying on her back, raises her open palm to the light. The shadow from her hand and short childish fingers symbolically falls on the face of the thoughtful blonde. As a result, the main character came to certain conclusions, and to such conclusions that enthusiasm and optimism overwhelmed her from her blonde head to her toes. The solution that was born in the head of the former dugout is actually very simple. In order to solve such an unpleasant problem, first of all, you need to make sure that it does not start at all. It is necessary to somehow ensure that the main characters of the original story do not come to visit. Then, Spencer's father will not die, and the girl will have no reason to hate. Secondly, it is necessary to establish the strongest possible connections with Theodore, that same half-brother, now also a child, only a few years older than Charlotte. In the end, everyone will be happy. The girl the fan has reincarnated into will not turn into a fury obsessed with retribution, will not antagonize the remaining family, will not be betrayed, and no one will kill her at a young age. But besides the banal fear for a new life, the main character was driven by another, no less strong motive. She really wanted to see her pet in person and admire him for as long as possible. If Ivy does not try to kill innocent people with a terrible witch explosion, the Royal Knight will not need to kill her. Such a simple and logical scheme should work. And so the protagonist, who became the new Ivy Charlotte Spencer, decided to act. Fortunately, she had whole decades ahead of her to turn history along a course favorable to herself. To emphasize the symbolism of what was happening, the girl went to the doors of her room and slowly opened them, as if striving to meet something beautiful far away. As time passed, Spencer, as befits the heiress of a great family, learned to defend herself, maintain a noble posture, but sometimes she became a hooligan, like any child. Time flew by extremely quickly. The protagonist used it to learn as much as possible about the daily life of the local nobles and make friends with her only brother. And even she herself did not notice that 12 whole years had passed, and the young girl had turned into a fragile but beautiful girl with luxurious golden hair, in no way inferior to her prototype from the earthly Japanese comic book. The action then moves to Alba, the central city of the local empire, where the magnificent Blanche Academy stands with its white walls and sparkling windows. Numerous students walk along its corridors and surroundings, but even among them one blonde girl stands out brightly, like a swan in a flock of ducks. She wears a beautiful blue dress, gold-plated heels, and her own hair reaches the small of her back and is so bright as if someone weaved it from the rays of the sun. Those around her feel real awe at the sight of her. Some red-haired girl, noticeably nervous, even respectfully greets Lady Ivy. The 17-year-old noblewoman, however, does not express any irritation or anger. On the contrary, she smiles friendly at the girls and wishes them good morning. After that, she continues on her way with the same smile. The students around her were also doing their own thing, walking somewhere or simply talking with friends about various things. Then the focus shifts to the blonde's thoughts. She jubilantly notes that all these 12 years she worked tirelessly, preparing for adulthood. Of course, since she was reborn as a very noble aristocrat, she had to study various disciplines, for example, palace etiquette and local humanities. Yes, there were certain difficulties, and worse than a lack of understanding of the material. For example, they tried to frame the head of the Spencer family many times. But the main character, who knows the plot of the original manga very well, always drove such scoundrels away without looking at their reputation and position in society. Of course, it was not easy to fuse everyone. With some intrigues, it was necessary to act radically, for example, to intimidate them with weapons and painful death. When her strength was not enough, the protagonist used a more subtle approach. She spread rumors because of which no one would shake hands with her enemies. Thanks to this many years of hard work, the Spencer house prospered like never before. All possible opponents, envious people, and saboteurs disappeared without having time to do anything. Even the main character of the original story, because of whom the life of young Charlotte went downhill, never appeared in their house, which nipped the tragedy in the bud. The girl's relationship with her stepbrother, who eventually defected to that same hero and helped him defeat the distraught Ivy, is also beautiful now. And finally, apart from the fight against the enemies described above, the protagonist did nothing wrong so as not to deserve the hatred of others, like the original Charlotte. When all the problems were solved, the main character triumphed. Nothing should have stopped her from freely stalking her pet and kissing the ground on which he walked. More precisely, the girl thought so. I don't even suspect that the villainous fate has her own, much less pleasant plans for the overly sneaky miscreant and her lover. A man in a military uniform suddenly appears right in front of Spencer and with tremendous force plunges his sword into the brick wall, just a centimeter from the aristocrat's head. All this happened so suddenly and unexpectedly that the main character did not even have time to get scared and scream. She only managed to squeeze out a quiet sigh. But what was even stranger was that the attacker, a young brunette with red eyes, also looked stunned, as if a demon had possessed him for a moment and then left, leaving him at a loss. Having some difficulty extracting the intact blade from the brick, the young warrior embarrassedly asked for forgiveness. He was told that there would be a suspicious person in this place. Sweating and stuttering, he tried to ask young Mrs. Ivy if she was hurt, and the noblewoman just looked at her new acquaintance with her eyes wide open in surprise. The awkward situation continued. Neither the knight nor the aristocrat really knew what to say after a failed attempt to detain or even kill. As a result, the girl was still able to quietly answer that she was not hurt, but the young man had already pulled his hands on her shoulders and neck, as if wanting to personally make sure of the safety of such an important person. What happened next completely unsettled the protagonist. The knight simply smiled faintly, and his gaze became very warm and somehow affectionate. Forgetting all respect, the warrior wrapped his hands around the heroine's face and pressed his forehead to her head, wailing that he didn't know what to do if Spencer had gotten hurt. Their eyes were very close to each other, and the situation itself was so intimate that Ivy felt a nervous shiver. Pulling herself together, she resolutely straightened up and pushed the young man away from her, forcing him to remember the rules of decency. He said nothing, and neither did Charlotte. But in her mind, she was a little panicked because she could not understand where such familiarity had come from at the first meeting. The knight, having recovered from the awkwardness, again extended his hand to the noble lady, but this time in order to apologize for the scene that had just occurred. Charlotte wanted to warn the impudent man not to test her patience any longer, but she immediately choked on a scream in her thoughts as soon as the guy touched her hand. These sensations were one of those that are very difficult to express in simple language, as if electric discharges ran through the body, turning off all sanity. The girl did not understand what she was doing and what was happening next to them, but she no longer wanted to think about it. She simply put her hand in someone else's palm. Some part of Ivy's mind was perplexed. This was absolutely not how she imagined their first meeting. It shouldn't have been so sudden and awkward. From the outside, the blonde seemed to be putting on a stone mask of calm and serenity, but inside she was squealing hysterically, sobbing and throwing imaginary furniture. The young man was the same Grayson Satches, but Charlotte was perplexed because the real guy was completely different from that silent, cute hero who defeated everyone with minimal effort. She imagined that in this reality he would be exactly like that. A fearless Terminator, whose beautiful face never leaves the expression of indifference to the rest of the world. Now that it became clear how mistaken Ivy was about her idol, she simply could not understand how to act and what to say next. Just take a look. The real Grayson looked at Spencer with an expression of remorse, timidity, and friendliness, which was completely at odds with the old image. Again, he also touched Charlotte's hand with a smile, as if he was trying to demonstrate to her the peacefulness of his intentions. Where are the echoes of the ruthless defender of the Empire in these actions? The contrast turned out to be so strong that the woman simply could not pull herself together. Her sanity was only enough to quietly answer, "Nothing terrible happened." Then the girl seemed to suddenly realize something so important that it was as if she had been struck by lightning from a clear sky. This result was so incredible. At the same time, her brain recalled numerous episodes from the manga featuring Grayson. For example, how he threatened a person with a blade, how he looked at his victims with contemptuous aloofness. Something like how a hungry snake examines its prey before strangling it in its coils or swallowing it alive. He, the original Satches, did not disdain even very dirty methods to achieve his goals and shed blood without hesitation. In a word, he was a typical cold anti-hero that girls adore so much. And right now, this man, who should be a cold-killing machine, was tenderly taking a woman's fragile palm as if it were a great treasure. He then gently brings her up to his face and kisses her, sending Ivy into another deep shock, complete with thick face paint. Their gazes meet again. Slowly ending the kiss, Grayson looked at the woman as if he had fallen madly in love with her as soon as he saw her. But Charlotte, trying to somehow reconcile old ideas with reality in her mind, decides that Grayson's current kind behavior is simply hypocrisy. For some reason, he is trying to win the favor of the heiress of the Spencer house. But why he needed this, the main character could not figure out now. She's not a villain anymore. She's never offended anyone except really bad people. She adores her brother and other relatives, so what's the point anyway? While the suspicious protagonist tried to justify why Satches was sucking up to her so much, the knight, without raising his head, asked if she forgives him. Even as a good-natured and open person, Grayson remained incredibly handsome in Ivy's eyes. She blushed deeply again and tried to understand why he was acting this way. For her, he remained an intriguer, cold-blooded and unprincipled, so any of his actions seemed like a carefully thought-out move of some kind of conspiracy. Here, the focus briefly moves to the side, showing the audience what was around the couple. A beautiful blue sky with white clouds, flowering trees and leaves playing in the wind. But in the end, the main character still found the strength in herself and broke the contact. She removed her hand and looked with some fear at the warrior towering above her. Grayson interpreted this in his own way and hastened to apologize for this as well. It was clear from his face that the young man was really very uncomfortable that he was embarrassing the beautiful lady so much. Charlotte Spencer blushed, looking at such a shy, but at the same time beautiful and friendly face. The conflict between reality and old ideas came into play again. The knight from the manga never changed his indifferent face, and this one was a walking generator of cuteness. Grayson himself, meanwhile, was trying to understand what was happening to Ivy. She was trembling, blushing, and could not squeeze out a word, as if he had somehow wounded her. It still couldn't go on like this indefinitely. With the greatest effort of will, the protagonist controlled her passions and hastened to assure Satches that everything was fine and it was time for her to deviate, which the main character hastened to do, leaving the young friendly knight to look after her with bewilderment and shock. The action returns to the estate of the royal Spencer family. Over the past years, during which the heroine grew up, this estate has not lost any of its beauty. Ivy throws herself on Theodore's neck. The young man was busy studying, but the protagonist, squealing from overwhelming emotions, begged her to tear herself away from the papers and listen. A characteristic grimace appeared on the face of the young green-eyed, brown-haired man. It demonstrated extreme fatigue and hidden pain, as if he had never fully gotten used to it. But the girl, absolutely not noticing the mournful face of her relative, hurried to tell him about her adventures. Her eyes were already burning with anticipation of the story. Theodore slowly turned his head towards her and just looked for a few seconds. Then he turned away, exhaled barely audibly, and asked what happened to her on the street. Fortunately, the audience was not treated to this squeal-filled, mundane, slang-filled narrative. The action moved forward a little when Charlotte finished. She just couldn't stop squealing and screaming about how wonderful and perfect Saches was, while Theo listened to her with a gray face from shame and fatigue. But in some ways, the situation really interested him. Grayson, after all, is the first sword and a close ally of the Crown Prince of the Empire, and it was strange that he began to drive wedges towards Ivy like that. The boy, in principle, is not against his sister starting a relationship with the warrior, but he asks not to say anything to their father. It is better for him not to know about this situation for the time being. Here, the main character finds a new reason to scream. She is indignant that Theo immediately signed her up as Grayson's girlfriend, although she actually didn't say a word about it. Unexpectedly, this makes the young man very tense. The bored expression instantly disappeared from his face. He began to sweat and began to find out what the knight wanted from Charlotte then. In response, she simply threw up her hands with the words, "I don't know." After all, if the girl had an answer, she would not have come running to her smart brother to find out his opinion. Actually, this whole awkward and shameful episode happened because she wanted to get guidance from Theodore, on whose face the expression of melancholy and pain had returned again. From Theo's thoughts, it turns out that even in the real world of heads and tails, Sazi's is approximately the same as the girl from a past life remembered him, cold and calm, so this behavior on his part is very strange. And this was the main danger. Such people usually do not start intimate acquaintances with young, inexperienced girls. Any motive can be hidden behind this. In any case, Ivy herself thought so. It seemed to her that Grayson wanted to gain some benefit by making the daughter of a rich and powerful family fall in love with him. Spencer did not hesitate to share these conclusions with her relative, and he was again very surprised. He did not expect such conclusions from his sister, especially since she still seemed pleased with what had happened. After that, the blonde became isolated in her thoughts about Grayson's supposed motives and how best she should react to all this. Throughout all these years, Charlotte tried at all costs to avoid repeating the actions of the original Ivy. Even threats and attacks on family enemies were carefully hidden. Therefore, the girl did not think that one of the Imperial Guards suspected her of something seditious. This option was too unlikely to be true. In the original work, Saches was practically the right hand of the Crown Prince. The future sovereign trusted him with all his secrets and assignments and was always under his protection. From this, the protagonist draws an unpleasant conclusion. The heir to the throne suspects the entire Spencer clan of something, but then the focus changes, moving the events to late evening. The audience is shown a certain palace, its gray walls in the darkness of the night, blue roofs and spires, as well as numerous windows with yellow lights. In one of the rooms, which resembled some kind of royal drawing room, a secret meeting was taking place. Someone announced that from that moment an investigation into the affairs of the Duke Spencer family had begun. Then this man, looking through various documents, asks his companion how everything went with the Duke's daughter, Ivy Charlotte. The speaker turned out to be a young man in rich clothes and with blonde hair, and his companion was an already well-known guardsman in a black uniform and with short black hair. At first, Sazi's did not answer anything. He looked at the owner with indifference, which the main character so adored in this character while reading manga on Earth. Then the young man remembers how this girl behaved, how desperately she blushed and was embarrassed in response to his rather banal actions. The knight hesitated, as if he did not know how best to choose the words to explain to the prince about the protagonist and her behavior after the false attack. As a result, he notes, a little awkwardly, that the reaction of the main character in general was somewhat unusual. They clearly expected something completely different from the Duke's daughter. The young blonde just grins, as if this whole situation seemed to him a fun and entertaining game with high stakes in which he was sure to win. Without looking at his faithful bodyguard, the heir to the imperial throne gives the next order to make sure that by the time the next ceremony is held, the Spencers will be exposed. The next day, the estate returns to normal life. The maids go about their daily routine, quietly humming songs as the sun shines through the window. Luxurious dishes were served in the Spencer dining room, and Ivy happily devoured one of them on both cheeks, completely forgetting about the rules of palace etiquette. She was so carried away that she didn't even notice how she began to slurp all over the room, and thereby attracted the attention of other family members. The Duke, the father of Charlotte and Theodore, looked at this with interest. Although he looked very young, this man had considerable experience behind him, and he immediately realized that something was wrong. As a result, he directly asked his daughter what happened to her. And then the protagonist, coming to her senses, tried to assure her father that everything was fine, but to no avail. By an effort of will, having returned to the appearance of a decent and modest lady, Ivy tried once again to convince the Duke that there was no reason to worry. She had everything under control. Nothing terrible was happening. The man said nothing. But from his look and facial expression, it was clear that he did not believe his deceiving daughter at all, and would like to ask her many more much tougher questions. However, the head of the house did not develop this topic. He only asked his daughter to immediately warn him if something got out of control, and Theo awkwardly looked away. He was clearly ashamed that he was hiding the truth about Grayson. Already in the corridor, the girl was thinking that she had relaxed too much. Her father almost saw through her, so in the future she must maintain strict secrecy. Ivy decided that all those thoughts about why the prince's confidant took on their family were reflected on her face, but then the protagonist was distracted by some noise from the window. It turned out to be a teenage boy, a little younger than the main character, with tousled hair and in noble clothes. Charlotte even knew him by name. As it turned out, his name was Arlo. He was the second child of Earl Cox, but for some reason his father sent him here to learn how to manage the family and the allotment. The girl reflects on what a burden it must be to be taught by her strict and formidable parent, but then she suddenly realizes something. Here the picture changes again. Instead of a rich estate, the events move to a busy market square, where a merchant offered a certain girl to try his kebab for free. Of course, this was the main character. She changed into a simple but clean peasant dress and changed her hairstyle in the hope of passing herself off as a commoner. And of course, she did not refuse a whole skewer of juicy fried meat and vegetables. On the contrary, Ivy was terribly grateful for such a gift. To maintain decorum, the protagonist not only thanked the kind merchant, but also handed him a bag of coins. Charlotte called them a tip, because taking something for free would be the height of indecency for her, and the man did not refuse such a gift. As it turned out, the cunning girl decided to take advantage of the fact that her high-ranking father was busy studying with Arlo, and sneaked out of the estate into the city for a walk. It seemed to Charlotte that changing her clothes and hairstyle would be enough so that no one would recognize her on the street, especially since she had also forgot about the need to maintain a noble posture. The reason for the escape was very simple. Although there are enough experienced chefs in the ducal kitchens, they always create only food that is healthy for the body, and the protagonist terribly wanted something harmful. Finishing the last piece of meat, the main character admitted that she now understands much better those people who, after moving to another universe, necessarily leaned on the local cuisine. And the girl didn't stop at the skewer. She wandered around the bazaar for a long time, buying various products and eating them right away, until she finally ate her fill of medieval fast food. Here Ivy thought for a moment that she should return. She had been absent for a long time, and no one knew about her disappearance. But then the protagonist's attention was attracted by something else. It turned out to be a tray full of precious jewelry, earrings, rings, and bracelets. But among them, Charlotte liked the red bow with scarlet gems the most. The sparkle of all these rubies, sapphires, and lapis lazuli so captured the attention of the young aristocrat that she did not even notice the man she knew, who had replaced his military uniform with simple clothes. Because of this, the appearance of Grayson Saches, who immediately asked the owner of the stall for some kind of decoration, was like a thunderclap in the middle of a clear sky for the protagonist. Realizing that they were looking at him very carefully, the young warrior turned around. The knight's face lit up with a slight smile, and warm lights seemed to light up in his eyes. But this did not calm the girl down. On the contrary, she became terribly embarrassed and nervous, because such a meeting could not be just a coincidence. In response to her unspoken questions, the man admitted that while passing next to the shop where the protagonist received a skewer with food, he noticed something beautiful, and then could not take his eyes off. He said all this with the sweetest and most innocent smile in the world, one that could deceive most girls, but not the main character. Ivy correctly understood that Grayson was simply watching her all this time, that she was wandering around the bazaar, enjoying various treats, and the disguise as a peasant woman did not deceive him. Seeing the tension on Spencer's face, Sanchez smiled peacefully and closed his eyes, convincing her that there was no need to worry so much about his presence. Moreover, he also had a gift for the young Duchess, that same bow decorated with numerous rubies, especially a large stone in the shape of a Valentine heart. Without asking permission, the knight placed this jewelry on the protagonist's head, and she was so taken aback that she did not even find the strength to object. Bringing his face closer to the woman's ear, Grayson whispers in an affirmative rather than questioning tone that the girl is in such a common place, incognito. The blonde raises her face, trying to look at the unexpected guest, and in Charlotte's purple, amethyst-like eyes there was fear and tense anticipation of what would happen next. Sanchez, however, pointedly ignored this look. Instead, he noted with the same friendliness that the new jewelry suited the blonde girl very well. In response, Charlotte tensed even more, and even blushed. Deep down, she continued to adore Grayson, and such compliments could not help but hurt her. Mentally, the girl even had to remind herself that the Imperial Guardsman was not her friend or boyfriend. Most likely he was a spy, and therefore she had to carefully watch her tongue in his presence. Unfortunately, the prince's bodyguard and agent clearly guessed what the main character was thinking about, so he casually clarified that she was at this bizarre incognito. Charlotte Spencer nodded automatically, feeling beads of sweat begin to flow down her temple. The situation had turned out so tense and even frightening. Even Grayson's smile, which at the first meeting caused incredible tenderness and delight, now seemed hypocritical and sinister, like that of a real blackmailer. In part, it was so. It quickly became clear that the guy was following the target not just to assess her behavior. As the first time, Sanchez needed some kind of service. We must give the main character her due. Someone else in her place could have become hysterical, fallen at Grayson's feet, or started threatening him. But Ivy just smiled and asked what he wanted. Now the fake smile of the former idol could not deceive the protagonist. She perfectly understood that she was walking on thin ice more than ever, and one wrong word could lead to the loss of everything she had worked for. Carefreely patting his boot on the sidewalk, the knight hastened to assure Charlotte that he didn't need anything special from her. Just mere little things were enough. Specifically, a chance to get to know Ivy Spencer as closely as possible, which Grayson told the girl, leaning towards her as if he was going to suddenly kiss her. Continuing to pretend that there was no hidden blackmail and unspoken threats, Sanchez repeated his request. He would like to get to know the young noblewoman as a person. The asshole looked at him with her eyes wide open in surprise and fear. Judging by the drops of sweat running down her face, she clearly felt like a rabbit next to a fox. Naturally, such tricks could not deceive her. Even she, not the most experienced girl in terms of intrigue, could see how suspicious and strange it all was. Meanwhile, people continued their usual activities. Merchants invited customers, inspected goods, or simply went about their business carefree. The protagonist also wanted something similar, just to walk around a busy place, to feel like an ordinary girl, but now she is trapped. Right now, she and Grayson were walking down the street. From the outside, it might seem that this was an ordinary young couple on a date. But in fact, the heroine wanted to scream out loud. As it turned out, a few minutes ago, Sanchez asked the victim to take a walk with him for a day. And this was exactly the kind of request that a sane person should not refuse. The guardsman's behavior unnerved the asshole more and more every second. It was simply too unpredictable, so it was not possible to mentally prepare for it. Trying her best to hide her panic, Ivy politely asked the man to let go of her hand. It would be uncomfortable for him to eat with his left limb, so such difficulties were not needed. The red-eyed brunette slowly turned his gaze to the object that he was holding in his left hand, and it was an ordinary small ice cream in a cone. After a few agonizing seconds, Sanchez turned and, with a beaming smile, assured the main character that no, he was not having a hard time at all, completely ruining her attempt to sneak away. The girl was able to control herself this time too, so she smiled joyfully in response, although just a few seconds ago, goosebumps were running down her back. Charlotte was sure that Grayson wanted to find out information about her father, the Duke, but it was unknown for what purposes, so Ivy waited with trepidation for developments. In addition, all this ostentatious carelessness and friendliness, false smile and glances frightened Spencer. She perfectly felt how the self-proclaimed gentleman was being a hypocrite, trying at any cost to please the young girl for who knows what purposes. Finally, the guardsman asked his question, but not about the Duke. He was interested in how often the protagonist escapes from the estate to secretly walk among the mob. As it turned out, everyone whom the main characters passed recognized the young aristocrat and offered her various things, fresh fruit or other products. The girl's habits had just backfired unpleasantly on her. During all her forays, she tried to try the local cuisine, so she inevitably became familiar with it. Then the red-eyed man casually adds that a certain daughter of the Duke, who has nothing to do with the main character, is very supportive of the commoners and does charity work, so they adore her. Sweating and stuttering, the protagonist tried to convince the escort that the rumors were significantly exaggerated. But then another merchant intervened in the conversation, friendly offering the blonde some fresh goodies. At the same time, she also called the hit Eve, a name very similar to her real Ivy, but Spencer hastened to assure him that this was a banal pseudonym. As a result, Charlotte gave up, and nevertheless agreed to buy some more food. Fortunately, there were fresh scarlet apples, juicy potatoes, and other luxuries on the counter. While Pseudo-Ava was choosing purchases, the owner of the shop decided to pour out her heart to her, like an old friend. It turned out that her husband decided to join a certain cult, which immediately alerted Grayson. Last night he disappeared without warning, and when he returned, he never gave his wife a sane answer, and the protagonist reacts to this news as if this was not the first time. Unfortunately, the main character could not somehow help her friend, so she answered with a simple, confused, "I see," not knowing that Sanchez behind her had turned to stone. Then she hastened to assure the merchant that there was no need to panic ahead of time because there was no evidence. And fortunately, Ivy did not see how empty and scary Grayson's gaze had become. However, the girl felt it. A chill seemed to run down her spine, and she turned sharply, expecting to meet the source of a new unknown danger. The woman behind the counter interpreted this in her own way. She decided that the man was annoyed that she was chatting with a friend instead of quickly serving another customer. Meanwhile, Grayson Sanchez had already regained control of himself. He grinned sweetly and assured that everything was fine, so Charlotte even wondered if she imagined she felt threatened by this man. As a result, the main characters walked until sunset. The sun began to fall below the horizon, painting the skies crimson, and tired, Ivy apologized to her companion for talking so much today. The guy carrying a paper bag of groceries rushed to assure her that it was very interesting to see Eve from an unexpected side, but she wearily asked him to just stop it. The red-eyed man only put his fist to his mouth, vainly hiding an even wider grin. He claimed that he was saying this absolutely seriously and sincerely. This made the girl freeze for a moment and think about how dramatically Grayson's facial expressions changed. Sometimes his falseness was noticeable to the naked eye, and sometimes he looked very natural. Then she suddenly realized that today the most dangerous enemy of her family found out one of the girl's main secrets, and only God knows what he will do with it in the future. Noticing this, Sanchez stopped grinning and looked at the blonde coldly, like an experienced hunter who was deciding how best to shoot his new prey. His mask returned again a moment later, and the guard suggested that Mrs. Spencer should go home. After all, the sun was already setting. There was nothing left until nightfall. The girl had no words or reasons to object, so she only timidly agreed, and the voice of the narrator, Ivy from the future, noted that from that day, it all began. Grayson also tried to offer the aristocrat to accompany her home, but she already remembered that she had not told anyone anything, so she had to run to the estate as fast as she could. To her great luck, behind the nearest building there was a carriage free of passengers, which Sachez pointed out, but none of them noticed a strange person with blue hair and a black cassock. Ivy, as a narrator, notes to the audience that at that time she did not yet know or suspect. At that moment her life was in dire danger. After some time, the audience is again shown the luxurious city academy, how the sunlight played on its white stone walls, reflecting from the gilding and windows. The main character, the young daughter of Duke Spencer, was just sitting on a bench in the park. She was struggling to hide her yawning, as if she couldn't sleep all night. As it turned out, this was the case every night. Charlotte, making sure that all the inhabitants of the estate were asleep, quietly made her way into her father's library, like a real spy looking for incriminating evidence. Thus, Ivy tried to find out for what sins her family was suspected by the eldest prince and his agents, but nothing meaningful could be learned from the Duke's records. He either kept them in another place or perfectly encrypted them. As a result, she unearthed only all sorts of nonsense. For example, rumors that one noblewoman maintains an unapproved relationship with the prince of another country. Another aristocrat grows plants that remove poisons, and someone hides behind the mask of a respectable husband for minor sins. For several seconds, the girl simply looked tiredly into the distance, and then sadly admitted that until she understood what the future emperor needed, Grayson would not give her peace. And then, as if on purpose, something happened that really frightened Ivy. A thick tail of smoke was coming from the red tower of the castle, as if there had been a very strong explosion inside and many things had caught fire. Here the narrative is briefly interrupted for the sake of a lecture by the protagonist. In the world of heads and tails, there is magic, and to create a spell people need mana, and its amount depends on the vessel with which the person was born. Thus, some people are born talented and skilled wizards, while others are born mediocre. But beyond this, control over mana depends on the emotions of the sorcerer. The smoke was coming from exactly the place where a special wing of the Ministry of Magic was located, but the explosion was still too strong for an accidental mistake in a spell or potion. Grayson Sachez hovered over Charlotte and worriedly suggested that they might have had a witchcraft accident, as if he had been sitting next to Ivy to begin with. To say that this scared the girl would be an understatement. She was incredibly scared and tense, as if a killer with a blade from a previous life was again next to her. Of course, it was just a matter of time before this man reappeared, but it was still too unexpected. And in the meantime, Sachez himself was trying to make sure that Charlotte was not injured. From the outside, he looked like the physical personification of charm and charisma, as sweet and courteous as possible. But the protagonist, deep down, was only angry because of his habit of appearing suddenly. The knight, trying to make small talk, noted that yesterday Spencer apparently reached her home estate safely, despite her walk through the bazaar. In fact, when she first arrived home, she was found by a panicking maid friend. It turned out that the Duke had long wanted to see his daughter, so the blonde had to run to her father as fast as she could. And this meeting ended with the concerned father giving his naughty daughter a real dressing down, although the protagonist chose not to remember the details. The prince's close associate continued to look at her with sympathy, and then suddenly caught himself, and noted that this time he had not arrived empty-handed. Sachez had some kind of gift under his uniform. It turned out to be a letter, but a very unusual one. It was made of black paper and had beautiful paintings on the sides, as if straight out of ancient Oriental paintings. When Charlotte Spencer began to examine the item with curiosity and bewilderment, the man admitted that he had delivered an invitation to the party. Perhaps he expected Ivy to be delighted and grateful for the honor, but in fact she became even more tense and a little scared. The guardsman, meanwhile, shared that his master, the heir to the throne of the empire, the eldest of the princes, will be present at this event. He admits that His Highness rarely visits such places, but this time he decided to make an exception and meet the daughter of the great Spencer family, driving the girl more and more into a corner. Finally, the warrior directly asks the blonde to come to this party, finally depriving her of the opportunity to refuse such an offer. As it turned out, in the manga, this prince was not a positive character at all. Like the original Charlotte Spencer, from the outside he seemed good-natured and amiable, but at heart he was a snob and a scoundrel. And although the girl was actually not too afraid of this man, he aroused sincere antipathy in her. She would never shake his hand. If she had had the opportunity, the misfit would have refused now. The prince may have been handsome, but she never wanted to meet such a vile person. In addition, the main character was annoyed that Grayson delivered the letter personally. Usually such invitations are delivered to the mansion in the general order, so such intrusiveness looks extremely suspicious. Desperate, the woman decided to refuse anyway. She supposedly had a good reason not to go, and it was very, very unfortunate. But the cunning Sanchez did not give the victim this opportunity. He remembered that the girl had promised him yesterday that she would fulfill the request in the future, and the man took advantage of this loophole by directly asking Spencer to come. He did not try to demand in an ultimatum form, but on the contrary, remained polite, said please, and smiled gently, as if Ivy was the more powerful person in their situation. However, Charlotte perfectly read what was left between the lines. If she refused, Grayson would tell the whole city about her forays in a peasant dress, and her cold eyes gave away the guy with his guts. Continuing to grin friendly and hiding his hands behind his back, the main character continued to masturbate the protagonist, cutting off the remaining opportunities for refusal. Grayson added that the girl's absence from the party would upset not only the prince, and she gave in, promising to look at her schedule and find a free hour. But Ivy was not going to talk further with this cold-blooded spy and killer. She decisively turned around and walked away, wishing her a good day. In her thoughts, the woman lamented. Even now, having personally learned how false, dangerous, and hypocritical her idol was, she could not stop admiring his appearance. However, Charlotte Spencer still had no intention of going to that damn party and meeting the unpleasant prince who was trying to get to the bottom of her family. Suddenly, a scream was heard. Grayson yelled for the protagonist to be careful, and she turned to him in bewilderment, not noticing the giant fireball. When she turned around and saw a huge cloud of flame rushing straight towards her, like a meteor burning in the atmosphere, she froze in mortal horror. It seemed that this was where the story of the young, come-to-mind Ivy would end. But when she came to her senses, she discovered that she was lying on the ground, and Grayson was covering her from above with a human shield. This embarrassed the blonde terribly, and she turned pink. Sanchez was lying right on top of her, and their faces were practically touching, as if during a date or even sex. Unable to withstand such emotional stress, the unfortunate girl simply passed out, so the knight began trying to bring the suspect to her senses. He carefully placed her head so that it would remain level, moved his knee, and began performing artificial respiration on the young aristocrat. And the trapped woman didn't actually lose consciousness, she just pretended to be. But now, feeling Sanchez's lips on her skin, she could barely control herself. Her embarrassment was so great that it took Ivy Spencer literally every ounce of willpower she had not to squeal and start rolling on the ground. The man, however, quickly realized that the girl was in fact alive and well. Grayson pulled back with a slight shock, and Charlotte awkwardly thanked him for his help. The main character was sure that something was flying over her, but moving her gaze, she noticed only a small hole on the ground, as if from under a decorative tree. However, this does not reassure the protagonist. She understood perfectly well that if that thing crashed into her, it would not have happened without serious injuries, especially if sorcerers were behind it. Then the girl is pierced by a new, even more terrible realization. What if that meteorite was created by Sanchez so that he would have a new reason to talk and get closer? The asshole breaks out in a cold sweat. She remembers that the guardsman is one of those people who are ready for any meanness to complete the task, and Grayson himself, meanwhile, noted that the unknown villains were aiming directly at the Duchess. The girl remembers how she first met her favorite characters, how the knight pressed the noblewoman to the wall and pierced the wall with a sword a centimeter from her head, so that the fireball would not look wild against this background. For a moment, the young aristocrat completely loses heart, realizing that her beloved hero could kill her at any moment. But then something else attracts her attention. She feels some kind of fantastic smell from the guardsman that goes beyond all known limits, and this knocks all the disturbing thoughts and fears about the guy out of Ivy's head. Instead of accepting the young man's hand, the woman violently clings to his clothes and demands to know what perfume he uses from the store. To say that this surprises Sanchez is a significant understatement. Even he, a cold-blooded thug who has seen a lot, was shocked by the girl's reaction. The main character froze with her mouth open. For a few seconds she seemed to be stuck, like a broken car. And then she again broke out in a sweat from realization. Ivy Charlotte Spencer was shocked by what she had just blurted out, and only God's help prevented her from screaming out loud, not caring about all decency. In her previous life on Earth, she several times encountered special branded perfumes, very fragrant but pleasant, with any aroma at the request of the customer. Since she was and still is an otaku, a fan of various merch, she instinctively reacted to the familiar scent, but in doing so, she drove herself into a trap. I should have thanked the man for saving her or said something else trivial, but now Ivy had literally dug her own grave and couldn't help but feel sad about it. But the way the young man reacted to her words was even more unexpected. Grayson simply laughed quietly, but not maliciously, and then playfully said that the perfume would be their secret. Seeing such a picture, the girl could not restrain herself. She again blushed from terrible embarrassment and felt a soft warmth as if spreading in her soul. The focus shifts briefly to the future. The day has ended and night has fallen. The black skies are illuminated by numerous stars and a huge full moon, similar to a silver coin. Returning to the estate, the protagonist did what many people do when they return home after a very difficult and stressful day. She collapsed backwards on the bed, groaning from fatigue. As it turned out, soon after the awkward conversation about spirits, the main characters split up. Sanchez, having mentioned the investigation of the incident, hurried off on business, and Spencer hurried to take her leave. However, there was still an envelope, like a menacing, silent reminder that the protagonist would have a meeting with an ominous prince playing some kind of savage game, and there was no way she could get away from it. In the depths of her soul, she hoped that at least at the party where the heir to the throne would be present, there would be no dangers. But she herself understood how unlikely this was. But then Charlotte sighed, clenched her fists tightly, and stood up decisively with the most militant look, as if she was completely tired of shaking and decided to show her teeth. This is partly how it turned out. The girl came to the conclusion that since another unpleasant meeting with Grayson could not be avoided, it was worth finding out his motives. Then there was a polite but decisive knock on the door separating the little Duchess's personal chambers from the rest of the estate, and the main character hurried to open them. Behind the threshold stood a slender but broad-shouldered man in a tailcoat and with a very unusual appearance. He had dark skin, like a resident of hot countries, but at the same time snow-white hair. In addition, the mysterious visitor also had green eyes of a very unusual shade, emerald, but the protagonist knew this man, Belle, very well and asked him if everything was okay. The time has come for the fateful celebration. Various carriages flocked to the palace flooded with lights, including the carriage belonging to Ivy Charlotte Spencer. She still had to come to this event, but she did not arrive alone. Already near the castle, the girl was met by a young man in a black tailcoat, her half-brother. Theodore, as before, was sad and gloomy. He clearly did not like this whole situation, but he had an agreement with his sister, and the blonde hastened to assure him that everything would be fine. If you didn't know in advance, then everything that was happening could be mistaken for an ordinary ball. Important aristocrats and nobles were everywhere, discussing some kind of gossip and business. But before the young representatives of the Spencer family had time to enter, the organizer and main hero of the occasion appeared before them, the Crown Prince in all his greatness. Seeing His Highness Leonard, Ivy and Theodore bowed respectfully and thanked the future emperor for honoring them with his invitation. In response, the young blonde tried to feign modesty. He waved his palm and asked him to straighten up, as if such honors embarrassed him terribly. Leonardo Lindbert Alba belonged to the Alba imperial family, the most powerful and influential on the entire continent, and from the outside, he seemed like a very nice young man. The young blonde notes with a smile that the Duke's children took a long time to get there, but Ivy, with a similar amiable grin, lies as if she simply lost sight of the sovereign after the greeting. Due to the fact that the heir to the throne's everyday life is terribly busy, it would be very difficult for her to meet Lindbert. But what luck that they ran into each other before the dance began. Grayson, accompanying the master like a shadow, reminded him that something would happen soon, and Leonard nodded casually. He's on his way. No need to worry. On this note, Alba had to say goodbye to Spencer, but he promised to meet the girl later. She responded with a completely false smile of greeting. In fact, the main character experienced monstrous stress and tension from communicating with these intriguers, as if she had a bomb mechanism in her head and it was about to explode. Meanwhile, the ball went on as usual. Noble guests slowly walked around the hall, men in military or noble clothes communicated, and noble ladies covered themselves with fans. The brother and sister went to a secluded place. Theodore noted that Charlotte could have danced with the prince without running away, but the girl did not even want to think about that. Then it turned out that this was not the first ball to which Alba had invited the Spencers. Each time he tried to invite Ivy, but she ran away under a plausible pretext, because the mere presence of the hypocritical prince made her feel uncomfortable. The brother may have understood her in his heart, but still noted that it was impossible to say such things out loud. The Spencers, in terms of nobility and wealth, are second only to the imperial family, so Charlotte is among the first candidates for the title of Leonardo's future bride. The protagonist did not answer anything to this. She just looked at Theo with a slight blush on her cheeks, which could mean that Ivy did not think about this possibility. In addition, unlike the main character who came from another world and knew the plot in advance, Theodore did not understand her dislike for Lindbert. The prince seemed to him a very good-natured, courteous, and polite person. In order to somehow justify her reluctance to marry Leonardo, Charlotte lies that she is not such a well-mannered lady as the heir to the throne would like her to be. Alba's entourage is full of girls who are much better versed in the etiquette and traditions of blue-blooded people, so the main character has no chance of winning his heart. But Theo only sighs in response. Since he was a native of this world, raised in its culture and moral standards, for him, Ivy's words were simply stupidity, because of which the Spencers could lose the opportunity to conclude an incredibly profitable marriage alliance. He grumbles that Charlotte should also understand this, and it's not long before he notices how the blonde, beaming with joy, is stuck to the railing. Noticing that he is looking at her, she explains to her stepbrother that she actually understands the situation, but so that they do not have problems, she will try to resolve everything peacefully. The main character runs away to greet other guests, leaving the perplexed Theodore to wait for the return of the restless relative in a secluded place. The young man only has time to shout to his sister not to run away because it is too dangerous. But the girl only carelessly shouts, "Okay," without even thinking about returning. Meanwhile, Grayson was walking somewhere on the lower floors of the palace. Now he did not at all resemble a friendly young man and looked like a dangerous, cold-blooded killer. The main character was also somewhere on the lower floors. She was carefree sipping wine from a glass, detachedly watching the dancers when someone turned to her. It was Belle, the same mysterious dark-skinned young man with white hair whom the protagonist met at the entrance to her room, and now she was clearly happy with him. This strange young man works at the Spencer estate as an ordinary butler, but this is formal, but in reality, his witchcraft power is such that Belle once carelessly lifted an entire castle into the air. He is an incredibly powerful sorcerer, so Ivy eventually decided to turn to him for help. While everyone is walking and celebrating, the white-haired guy is rummaging through the prince's documents, averting the eyes of the guards and servants. Alone, Charlotte had very little chance against such seasoned schemers as Leonardo and Grayson, so she decided to join forces with the sorcerer butler. Belle managed to unearth some facts, and he very quietly whispered them in the lady's ear, and she opened her eyes wide in surprise and froze, like a pillar of salt. In the end, she answered with a laconic, "Good." After that, the young wizard wanted to add something else, but then the girl unceremoniously interrupted him, poking his fingers into his lips. She had a chocolate candy in her hand. From the outside, one would think that the aristocrat was simply treating a dear friend. But in fact, Ivy remembered the proverb, "Even the walls have ears." Continuing to chatter carefreely about everything, the protagonist notes that the chocolate from this reception is incredibly tasty. She has never seen anything like it before. The girl asked whether Belle liked such sweets, and he agreed with a barely noticeable smile, as if he was charmed by the charm of the young mistress. The Popadka promised that next time she would prepare some sweets herself, and meanwhile the people in the hall had already begun to dance. The girl could no longer talk to the suspicious man dressed as a servant, so Ivy quickly waved her hand at Belle and flew away to the side. For a while the white-haired young man looked after the blonde, and there was sincere warmth and friendliness in his jade eyes, But then something else caught his attention. As it turned out, it was Grayson and Leonardo. Taking advantage of the fact that the guests were completely absorbed in each other, the intriguers began to quietly exchange information. After this, the action moves to the outer territory of the palace. Night has long fallen outside, and the black skies are decorated with an unnaturally bright moon in the company of a whole sea of white stars. In the garden adjacent to the building, there was a small gazebo made of a white material similar to Roman marble, and here a rather tired Charlotte Spencer was catching her breath. At first she was just resting, but then she blushed desperately and grabbed her face. As it turned out, she met Sacha's again and now could not stop the fever of love. When Grayson saw the girl arriving at the party, he turned to her and smiled. And although the mistress was well aware of how fake it all was, she could not cope with the feelings. The main character was so forgotten, absorbed in her own emotions, that she barely whispered out loud, as if trying to cope with her feelings, "He's guilty." And then, according to the law of the genre, Grayson himself was nearby. He perfectly heard Spencer's whisper, and now playfully asked the young aristocrat if she was waiting for him in the garden. Without giving Ivy the opportunity to come to her senses, the guardsman began to interrogate her. Who she called guilty here, and what she actually lost in the garden when the celebration was still going on. The girl blushed and sweated, feeling how love was again raising its head, and Sanchez, with a veiled threat, reported that he did not see her at the ball, as he had asked earlier. Of course, the girl came to the party and even took part in it a little, and Grayson, as luck would have it, was busy with something completely different, and simply did not see it. This helps the protagonist calm down, and after that she strikes. With an innocent smile, she asks if the knight was searching for his high-born overlord? But what followed next completely unsettled Ivy Spencer. A shadow of incredible melancholy and boredom came over Grayson's face, and he answered this provocative question with a laconic no. The main character again felt a surge of incredible tenderness. Her favorite character could break her will even with the most trifling words or actions. In order to somehow diffuse the situation, the blonde invited the unexpected visitor to just sit next to her for now, and Sanchez did not refuse this time. Some time passed, and as it turned out, the main characters sat silently for 10 minutes, not looking at each other, making the situation more and more awkward. Poor Charlotte's eye began to twitch more and more from such painful tension. She really needed to speak first, but the words did not come to her tongue. This was largely Grayson's fault. For all her enthusiasm, the protagonist did not forget that he was constantly lying to her, and she had no idea what could be said to such a two-faced person to maintain a friendly atmosphere. Fortunately for her, it was Sanchez who spoke first. But then it turned out that Prince Alba was eyeing the young Duchess as a bride, and the guardsman was interested in what the girl herself thought about this. It was such a strong shock that Ivy Spencer could not answer anything. She simply lost her tongue, but the knight was not going to wait for her to come to her senses. He directly ordered her to answer. Then the man with red eyes, without waiting for the woman's opinion, comes to a different conclusion. Slowly, with some apprehension, he asks if the girl already has a betrothed. The main character, clenching her fist with great force and crumpling her expensive dress, answers with difficulty, "No, she doesn't have any groom or just a lover now." Grayson, feigning excitement and interest, demands to clarify once again whether this is true, and the protagonist quietly repeats that, yes, she is a free woman. Meanwhile, amazing thoughts flash through the main character's head. She reflects on how amazing this whole situation is and how close Sanchez has become to her. However, this still does not calm the young knight. He remembers that one of the sons of Count Cox often visits the Spencer estate. And then, Grayson directly asks Charlotte, not caring about the rules of decency. After all, she definitely does not have any romantic relationship with this young man. Typically, the main character was not at all surprised by such an interrogation. On the contrary, she was waiting for it, because the faithful Belle confirmed the guest that the prince was collecting information about Duchess Spencer using his best lackey. But distracted by the pseudo-intimate atmosphere and reflections, the protagonist did not immediately understand that by the Count's son, Sanchez meant Arlo, her father's student. At that moment, the air around seemed to change. The romance disappeared, and the trapped woman thought with slight fear that Arlo had indeed been visiting often lately. Spencer's fear was not hidden from the trained eye of the Imperial Guardsman. He frowned and demanded to know what happened, why the girl didn't answer him. If she behaved so withdrawn, then it follows that all those piquant rumors were true. And this makes the main character involuntarily gasp. In fact, the reason was completely different. Grayson, having forgotten about maintaining his distance, sat very close, almost right next to the blonde, and stared into her eyes, incredibly embarrassing Ivy. And she asked in a slurred tongue to get even closer. Apparently, this answer greatly disappointed the servant of Prince Leonardo. Sachez stopped pretending to be interested, and a mask of indifference to everything returned to his face. But then something even stranger happened. The man, quietly saying, "So it's true," sat even closer to the young girl and gently but powerfully took her hand. With his other hand, the knight hugged the aristocrat's thin waist and even brought his face so close to Ivy's face that their noses practically collided. The atmosphere changed again. This time it was as if quiet, romantic music was playing in the air and bright lights were falling from the sky because things were clearly moving towards something intimate. Like an experienced seducer, Grayson seduced the innocent and inexperienced girl. He opened his mouth, preparing to bury her lips in a hot kiss, and Charlotte blushed desperately, unable to resist the temptation. Fortunately, such actions finally overwhelmed the main character's patience. She came to her senses, broke out of the guardsman's embrace, covered his mouth with her palm, and then in one breath shouted out that Arlo Cox was not her boyfriend. For a few seconds both main characters froze, looking into each other's eyes in disbelief, but then Grayson, continuing to hold the blonde's hand and waist, gently sat back on the bench. The next minutes for the protagonist were akin to being doused with a bucket of ice water. She clearly realized that Sachez was still deeply indifferent to her, and all his actions were aimed only at collecting information for Prince Lindbert. An awkward and uncomfortable situation reigned. The brunette continued to hug and hold the young duchess, as if trying to lead her into a dance, and she held her hand to his mouth, not allowing him to kiss her again. Very slowly and softly, as if afraid of provoking or frightening the woman, Sachez took her hand away from his lips. And now there was no trace of warm feelings on his face, only indifference mixed with notes of cold contempt. Ivy stared at the man in fear. Her face turned red and she sweated a little. Now one could expect any, even very unpleasant actions from him. Fortunately, Grayson had no intention of attacking such an important person. They simply began to sit silently again, looking at each other and thinking about something of their own. This time the brunette is the first to speak again, but now he didn't want to talk about romance. He succinctly asks Charlotte if she knew that Arlo was being used. The girl, without answering anything, only nodded with a blank expression, and Sachez looked at her carefully again. Now there was slight interest and even sympathy in his eyes. As it turned out, the protagonist did not believe that the young man was guilty of anything, and therefore was ready to defend him. But his family was a completely different matter. Spencer understood that they were weaving a conspiracy. The girl was clearly ready to tell her interlocutor everything she knew about the Coxes' sins, starting with their eldest son, but she stopped short, realizing that the guardsman was no longer listening to her. And so it was. Grayson was completely immersed in memories of how one moonless night, another informal meeting was taking place in the Imperial Palace. He was conducted as usual by Prince Leonardo Lindbert, and his only listener and interlocutor was Sachez, the most skillful and devoted bodyguard. The future emperor had a letter with important information in his hand, and Alba began his speech by saying that he finally understood something regarding a certain religious organization. It was a mysterious cult. The authorities knew little about it, despite all attempts to investigate, but the sect was rapidly gaining influence among the common people. However, Leonardo was worried not so much by this as by the fact that among the adherents of this organization there was a mysterious family whose representatives attended all meetings of like-minded people. And the prince knew for sure that among these agents was Arlo, the second son of the wealthy Count family of Cox, the same protege of the protagonist's parents. He regularly visits Duke Spencer's property, has a close relationship with his daughter, and Lindbert was also informed that Arlo and Ivy are in a relationship. Right now there are no bad rumors about the Coxes and their organization, but the idea that they were gaining influence over such a powerful house required verification, and the prince clarified whether Grayson had found Charlotte. The guardsman, however, wanted to clarify why his master decided to start with the girl. Saachez had slightly different information about this situation, but Leonardo answered with discouraging directness. He chose the young main character as the first target of his test for the trivial reason that she is in love with his most valuable agent and practically his first assistant. The black-haired man stared at the young blonde with a mixture of bewilderment and irritation, as if this was all a ridiculous joke, and the imperial son only laughed. After this, Alba began to think out loud. The Spencers had a reputation for being very strict and straightforward people, but their daughter was clearly cut from a different cloth. Ivy was not only young and head over heels in love with the red-eyed brunette, but also easygoing, so the owner told Grayson to pretend that he also had feelings for her, to carry out the operation without mistakes, as he had always done before. Right now, looking at the reddened, slightly frightened face of the young girl, Saachez thought he would come closer to use her for his mission. But it was easy to say, but to do it was completely different. The usually cool and decisive man awkwardly looked at the protagonist and then exhaled heavily and slowly. For several seconds, the two main characters looked at each other, the girl with trepidation and fear, and the man with longing and regret. But then Grayson resolutely turned around and walked away. Sometime later, already inside the palace, Ivy Charlotte Spencer was blaming herself in every way because of how stupid she had behaved, but the expression on Saachez's face was so sweet that she had no strength to resist him. She was hysterical, kicking her legs and screaming into the pillow on her brother's bed. Theodore looked at this with a feeling of incredible shame, and Belle calmly looked around the room. The young man was quite annoyed with his sister's behavior, so he finally asked her directly where the guy she was screaming about was, and in general, let her finally get off his bed. But to no avail. Ivy was overwhelmed by such a storm of emotions that only a good shake or a swim in icy water could bring her to sanity. As a result, the men left the girl alone and began to discuss the state of affairs. Theo was interested in what Saachez wanted before Charlotte asked Belle for help, but it turned out that it was nothing. As a result, one of the guys decided that if there was no danger to anyone, then it was better for them to go to their rooms and rest, and the other quickly agreed with this. Meanwhile, the audience is shown some dark alley outside the city. There are very few stars here, and the moon does not shine, so all that can be seen is a dilapidated shack and crooked trees. Inside stood a man already familiar to readers with blue hair in a dark cloak. Someone who had just entered the shack asked if he was ready for something. It turned out to be a young girl in an ordinary peasant dress. She did not look dangerous, and moreover, she herself was clearly afraid of the guest, in front of whom lay a blade in a sheath. For several seconds, the blue-haired man chewed his lips furiously and ground his teeth until he finally screamed. Yes, he was ready, and there was a specific culprit for this reaction. Then the man grabbed the sword from the table and began to slowly draw it from its sheath. The gray blade sparkled in the weak light, and the hands gripping the weapon tensed. The unknown conspirator swore that he would now take any action to end the life of this girl, that is, the main character, who at that moment was carefree resting with her brother and butler friend. The next day, the action returns to the Spencer estate. As always, beautiful, it looked very peaceful and serene, surrounded by green and flowering trees. Arlo, the youngest son of Count Cox, was walking down the corridor. He was a young man in rich, noble clothes, green eyes, and blonde hair, and he was greeting someone. As it turned out, the boy met the protagonist, but contrary to usual, she was in no hurry to greet her friend in return, but, on the contrary, looked distant. She notes that Arlo came to visit on this day, to which the young aristocrat carelessly agrees with a happy grin on his face, not noticing the true mood of his interlocutor. Then the young man suddenly says that he wants to clarify something about Prince Leonardo's last party, and the main character immediately tenses up, thinking that the conversation will be about the Cox's affairs. Fortunately, everything turned out to be much simpler and more harmless. The boy was simply interested in whether his girlfriend had a date with someone, and such a question turned Quince's face to stone. Then she resolutely declares that nothing happened, but young Cox retorts that she was seen alone in the garden with Saachez. At the same time, it turns out that Grayson is also a nobleman, bearing the title of Count, and not just a grunt close to the imperial family. In her thoughts, Spencer laments that she had no such intentions. She simply tried to hide from the clingy Leonardo in the garden, and it turned out that she was found by an imperial guard. But then the focus shifts to a completely different episode. Arlo was sitting in the living room with another man, and he was telling him that people gathering at meetings were singing about wanting to revive the witch, whatever that meant. The usually optimistic and calm young man looked tense, and he could easily be understood, because his father and older brother took an active part in these bacchanalia. This conversation between the Earl's heir and Duke Spencer took place a month before the main plot, just when Arlo began to visit his mentor more often, and Ivy overheard their conversation. Count Cox and his heir, it turns out, were not the leaders of the mysterious sect. On the contrary, they were among those unfortunate people who were brainwashed, turning into fanatics, ready to do anything for the new family. Nobody knew the name of this cult. Commoners simply called it a religious organization, which did not stop the sect from capturing more and more new members, extending the tentacles of influence further and further. The secrecy of these people was at the highest level. Many had heard a lot about them, but almost no one could say anything specific, although such individuals who had an idea of the extremely intricate structure of the organization existed. The virtual complete absence of any reliable and complete information was the main reason why even the usual ominous rumors about the activities of the sect did not circulate on the streets, and even the nobles were powerless. Meanwhile, Duke Spencer continued to deal with the affairs of his vassal, and they were not very attractive, because the Count was stealing the wealth of the lands, albeit bit by bit. This news made Arlo open his mouth in horror. It was clearly about his father, and the boy did not want to imagine what punishment could fall on their family for embezzlement. Unlike the Spencers, with their impeccable reputation, the Coxes enjoyed more disrepute, so that the young aristocrat even had to stand up and apologize to the overlord. Bowing his head and trying to suppress his fear, Arlo assured the older man that this was the first time. Before that, his father and older brother had lived stupidly honestly. Ivy's parent asked why the innocent young man would get involved in this, and he admitted that he really wanted to help his relatives, to open their eyes. But the Duke was not impressed by this altruism. However, the young man continued to beg for mercy, and even asked the gentleman for help in saving his family. None of them then noticed Charlotte peeking. After some deliberation, the head of the ducal house agreed, although he put forward some conditions to the young man. But he loved his father and older brother so much that he furiously shook his head, expressing agreement with anything. That's how Arlo turned into a spy for Spencer Sr., obliging himself to regularly come to him and report on any actions of his fanatical family. The main character remembered all this, while she continued to scratch her tongue with the young Count at the moment. He complained about the severity of the protagonist's father and asked to be softer towards him, but Ivy destroyed his hopes, saying that any requests were useless. Any reliable information about the goals, structure, and size of the religious organization is what Lindbert was eager to receive all this time, sending Grayson to Charlotte. The main character decided to herself that at the first opportunity she would convey all this information to Leonardo. Then he would finally get rid of her clan, and she would no longer have to meet with Sachas, calming her heart going crazy. However, the idea that the poor woman would no longer be destined to meet the black-haired knight and see his affectionate, albeit completely false, smile did not seem so clear-cut. In fact, the young blonde herself did not notice how she once again became fantasized and turned pink, thinking about her favorite idol. And just then, a maid appeared, worried about something. It was Rosie, the protagonist's confidant, and, in fact, her friend. Charlotte was very surprised that she was in such a hurry to see her mistress that she could not catch her breath. And the news turned out to be the kind of news that makes people slowly sink to the floor. There is a certain imperial knight near the estate, and he demands a meeting with Ivy Spencer. Naturally, the main character first thought about her favorite. How beautiful and pathetic he would look in these corridors, illuminated by the rays of the setting sun. With difficulty maintaining her composure, Charlotte demanded that Rosie immediately lay out all the details, but the maid only said that Mr. Grayson was waiting in the living room because it was impossible to force him to wait for the appearance of the aristocrat on the threshold. None of them noticed how a man with a dissatisfied look suddenly appeared behind them until Sachez himself called out to the girls who were talking. He looked not only irritated, but also tired, as if working with the protagonist had already become a burden for the weepy one, which he wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. Ivy froze with her mouth open and eyes wide open, as she had done many times when she saw Grayson up close, as if he were a hungry snake and she was a helpless little rabbit. The action then moves to the Imperial Palace. Leonardo Lindbergh Albo, looking like a lazy, good-natured cat, noted that the interlocutor arrived very quickly, although he sent for her in a hurry. The young Duchess, squeezing out a radiant smile, admitted that it was so. Nevertheless, the confidant of the first prince appeared very unexpectedly, and she was quite surprised by this. Outwardly, the blonde looked like a friendly son, but in her heart she screamed and sobbed. Charlotte was still disgusted by Albo's company, and she did not understand why she could be called to the palace. Suddenly Lindbergh stared at her with a very sour and dissatisfied face, like a child who demanded to buy some kind of toy but was refused. When asked what it was, the prince quickly returned his usual grin and replied that it was nothing. The blonde clearly wanted to change the subject to something else. He directly notices that the young Duchess, for some reason, is trying very hard to avoid his company, but at the same time is connected with Sanchez. But Leonardo hopes that the protagonist will change her mind. In her thoughts, the girl notes that it was precisely because of this attitude towards others that she hated the prince even on Earth, when he was just a fictional hero. The heroine understands that Albo believes that she and Grayson are in love with each other and is trying to play on this, in addition to mistaking her interlocutor for a naive idiot. And Ivy decided to play along, very skillfully portraying in front of the young sovereign a fool in love who could not cope with her attraction to the brave warrior. The girl even noted the irony to herself. In the original manga, the prince was one of the main characters, and the protagonist loved him very much, so it's even a pity that this girl is not here. Charlotte's reaction took Albo by surprise. For several seconds he could not even say anything, and then immediately moved on to discussing the mysterious underground cult. Although these people have not yet created such disturbances as you would expect from a fanatical sect, they still cause serious concern among the imperial family with their omnipresence and elusiveness. Several loyal knights once followed the sectarians to their meeting place, but were unable to do anything more. The door was sealed by a fanatic using special magic. Both Leonardo and the main character were tensed by the news that these people have their own magicians who wield powerful spells. After all, this makes the situation much more dangerous. That spell that kept government agents out was akin to magic circles. They have a very wide range of uses, and one of them protects the Spencer estate. The protagonist recalls with slight embarrassment how, as a child, she had fun with Belle, drawing magic pentagrams like ordinary children, drawings from chalk, while Lindbergh, meanwhile, continued his story. At first he thought the circle was just a coincidence, but when he learned about Arlo, his family's connections to cultists, and his frequent visits to the Duke's house, he thought it might be a clue that could finally bring the organization to light. Hearing her friend's name, Ivy fell silent for a while, and then lowered her eyes and decided to tell it like it was, after which the prince officially removed suspicion from her family. When all the troubles were over, Leonardo cordially opened the doors to the girl, only he also put his hand on her waist, as if she was already his bride. Affectionately touching her head, Albo invited Charlotte to come in for a conversation at any time, and the blonde endured this with all possible stoicism, driving her disgust deeper. Having completed the exchange of pleasantries and respectfully kissed the Duchess on the hand, the prince ordered the faithful Sanchez to accompany her home, to which the knight nodded dryly without demonstrating any emotion. Already in the corridor, Ivy lamented out loud about her fatigue. As it turned out, Leonardo offered her cooperation in investigating the cult, and they would exchange all known information about the sect. The girl was in such a hurry to get home to take a break from all these political games and tension that she agreed without really thinking about it. But fortunately, then Belle caught her eye, coming out of some room. The protagonist ran up to him as fast as she could, asking if the young butler and sorcerer had heard the end of their conversation. As it turned out, the Emperor's heir invited this young man separately, and the main character, naturally, was worried about the well-being of her best friend. Fortunately, now all the difficulties are definitely behind them. They can safely return home and happily take a break from the Games of Thrones. But then something else attracts Charlotte's attention. As it turned out, The girl only now noticed that the white-haired young man was acting much quieter than usual, and that he was looking at the Duchess with an expression of sorrow, as if something bad had happened. She doesn't even have time to ask Belle if everything is fine with him. The boy himself takes a step towards, and then drops his head on Ivy's shoulder, as if the heaviest burden in the universe was on his shoulders. To say that this shocked the little girl would be an understatement. She was so shocked by such a strange gesture that she mechanically stroked her friend's wide, flat back. Then young Spencer found the strength to timidly call Belle by name, but he still continued to stand silently, poking into her shoulder like a drowning man into a life preserver. The main character did not see this, but in fact the young man looked very bad. His face was red and drops of sweat were streaming down him, as if he had worked hard for many hours.